The pandemic has had a negative impact on various asset classes, not least stocks and bonds. As a result of this, of course, investors have looked for alternative sources of investments to asset classes that haven't been as exposed to the pandemic as stocks and bonds, and therefore have resorted to sort of crypto assets. And we've seen both retail and institutional investors being quite interested in this space. We've seen the likes of institutional investors that were slightly skeptical about the space, sort of investing in it, such as, for example, Rufer investment companies. We've seen BlackRock, the private equity firm. We've seen other financial institutions, particularly those involved in the payment space, such as PayPal and Square, making huge investments, particularly in Bitcoin. So yes, right. These adoptions by mainstream institutional investors as well as financial institutions involved in the payment space has, if you like, thrust Bitcoin into the mainstream.
Okay, and Gavin, would you agree that Bitcoin is heading towards the mainstream because of the pandemic?
I guess to some extent it depends on how we define mainstream, but it's certainly becoming more prevalent and is sort of raising more awareness across a bigger proportion of the population. I think another key thing to think about is central bank policy and monetary policy here. So what we've seen in this kind of record low interest rates that we've got at the moment, we've got the Bank of England consulting on negative interest rates, and we're in a crisis now, which is obviously a magnitude of order more than the financial crisis of about a year ago in 07, 09. And generally speaking, the central banks of the world are resorting to quantitative easing, so effectively expanding the money supply to be able to sort of buy their way out of the crisis. And obviously the problem with that is that it debases or devalues your currency, which means then that suddenly if that starts to occur quite rapidly, and increasingly is the case that is happening on a global basis, people will then start to looking for more scarce assets. And traditionally they would look towards assets such as gold, etc. But Bitcoin does have this unique feature that its supply side is fixed and known and beyond the reach and influence of politicians and central banks, which I think is something that certainly makes it appealing.
You mentioned, Gavin, the Bank of England. The Bank of England governor has said that even though Bitcoin hit an all-time high this year, the Bank of England governor is saying it's unlikely to work as payment in the long term. And he also said that don't put money in you can't afford to lose. That's not exactly validation of cryptocurrency, is it?
It's not, no, but I think to some extent we need to be careful about what we're thinking here. So that kind of argument is true, but it's based really on capacity. So if you look at Bitcoin and similar decentralized currencies as they're known, Bitcoin in particular can process about 7 transactions per second. And that compares to something like Visa, which can do sort of 20 to 30,000 transactions per second. So it's quite true that a vehicle or a currency such as Bitcoin certainly cannot replace our existing monetary systems at the moment, nor the payment systems either. However, if I was to take you back 100 years or so and show you the Wright brothers and their attempts at aviation and tell you that it was going to change the world and international travel, you wouldn't necessarily see what it could become. And I think the interesting thing with Bitcoin is that it's not just a proof of concept, it's a concept which has been working.
Dr. Salami, one of the key problems with cryptocurrencies is regarded as regulation, or rather the lack of regulation. How do you think we should be regulating cryptocurrencies?
Okay, so usually the rationale for regulation is, particularly in these types of assets, is primarily investor protection, market integrity, that is to have a transparent and fair market, and to ensure that these types of assets don't facilitate financial instability, i.e. the preservation of systemic risk. And the thing is, if we do not begin to, the way these assets are operating, they're operating pretty much as financial assets. And therefore, if we don't regulate them, what we're really putting ourselves out there for is that there will be risks to investors, there will be potential market manipulation happening through the lack of regulation of the space or in the space. There would also be a potential of financial instability, that risk that we're trying to avoid.
Gavin, isn't one problem possibly that the more regulation that you introduce, the more cryptocurrencies start to feel like more like central bank regulated currencies? In other words, could regulation kill the currencies?
In my view, probably not. And the reason for that is that a lot of these digital assets, or crypto assets as we might call them, such as Bitcoin, are largely beyond the reaches of regulation in terms of their substance. And the reason for that is that, Bitcoin isn't a listed company, it doesn't have a board of directors, doesn't have a governance structure, it doesn't have any tax domicile. It's not a physical or even normal organization as we would come to know it. So to actually regulate a lot of these assets is not necessarily impossible, but is certainly beyond the reach of our existing kind of structures in terms of how we operate in terms of regulation and law, which I'm sure Dr. Salami has more to say on than I. But I think the other thing that we almost need to bear in mind as well with this is that there's really a three-way competition at the moment for the future of money. We've got decentralized currencies such as cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, etc. We've also got central bank digital currencies, which is really the nation states recognizing this external threat and starting to come up with their own versions of these currencies to try and almost, rather than fighting and regulating and attempting to frustrate these technologies, why not introduce a more mainstream technology which is more conducive to your citizenship? And hopefully that will drive adoption and keep the threat of something like Bitcoin away. And then finally, we've got the idea of corporate currencies. So this would be the idea of people like Facebook and JP Morgan already either having launched or planning to launch their own currencies. So the future of money is certainly very exciting at the moment and is very much up for grabs in terms of what the future might hold.
And Gavin, where do you think the crypto or digital currencies are heading now in the medium to long term?
I think medium to long term, they're probably a good bet, in terms of their speculative ability. Dr. Salami was talking there about, the kind of utility that you get or don't get from some of these currencies. But, at the moment, it is starting to shake things up. If you're a Sri Lankan national working at the US and sending money back home, you may have expected to pay up to 20% in transaction fees and maybe spend 3 days waiting for that money to clear and settle. So although the currencies such as Bitcoin are highly volatile and can sometimes be expensive, to certain people in certain economies, it can actually be preferable to their current functional money.
Dr. Salami, a gentleman called Craig Wright, who's credited and who claims to have invented Bitcoin, says, I invented Bitcoin, now it's a Ponzi scheme. He says it was meant to be a successor to cash, not a tool of speculation. What do you say to that?
So investigations are underway by the New York Attorney General's office, sort of looking at the connections, for example, with Tether and Bitfinex, and how that sort of has or continues to impact on the price of Bitcoin. So there are quite a few issues around really what has, come out, if you like, of Bitcoin in itself. Now, I have to say that the technology around it, i.e. distributed ledger technology, the blockchain, is a good thing and isn't problematic. And so we're seeing some quite innovative ideas that's happening on the Ethereum network, for example, and seeing things like decentralized finance, which Gavin, was talking about, and the things around the alternative financial services being built on those types of platforms that really highlight the direction, if you like, of the future of finance. So there's some good things coming out from that have resulted, if you like, from the launch of Bitcoin. Bitcoin in itself, there's still issues that I feel would need to be addressed and looked at moving forward.
And I think many would agree with you. Dr. Salami and Gavin Brown, thank you both for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.